Thank you very much, Rachel, and thanks to all of you for a really lovely welcome. I've worked very closely with clinical psychologists in my recent career and really enjoyed that interaction. I'm a sociologist, that's my mission, but I'm on the psychological side of sociology. And I know many of you are on the maybe sociological side or social side of psychology. And really, you have a different training and a different skill set, but we need each other. And the people that we meet and work with, the groups that we engage with, their lives are complicated, and I think they need both our sets of insights. And it was very interesting. This morning, I attended the session where young people were talking about identity. It was a wonderful start, and it was exactly what I'm interested in. And I just listened to them talking about the price of speaking for themselves is to speak in the category which we'll allocate them. Even being here, they want to resist their diagnosis, and I know many psychologists are very opposed to the sort of clinical diagnostic approach, but the price of speaking as themselves is speaking with that diagnosis. And that's exactly what I mean in my rather abstruse title about subjection and subjectification. So it's Brexit. So I'm going to talk about Foucault quite a lot, forgive me. But Michel Foucault, the French philosopher and indeed psychologist, said, do not ask me who I am. Do not expect me to remain the same. Leave it to the police and the border guards to check that our papers are in order. And I think that's very interesting. We can think about identity in two ways. We identify people as an active word. We uncover them. We diagnose them. We give them their papers. But we also have identity in a reflexive sense. It's who I am. It's who I claim for myself. So we have top down and bottom up. And that's the tension that I want to talk about. Subjection and subjectification. They are inextricably allied. We have surveillance. We have passes. We have passports. We have all of that panoply. We have the internet, and we've heard a lot about that recently. But also, we have self-help groups. We have the online world. Twitter is all about people claiming their identities for themselves, speaking the truth about themselves. So Foucault again says, one should not be a homosexual, but one who clings passionately to the idea of being gay. So he's saying, don't take what you're defined as, define yourself. So what's interesting, and from my area of disability rights, is that the disability movement, which came kicking and screaming onto our stages probably in the late 1960s, developed strength through the 1970s, and it's been really very powerful in our lives over the last 30 years. It's throughout my life, really. It offers people new possibilities. You may not be working in the area of disability, but I am absolutely sure that what I'm saying is relevant to the area that you work in. Because all of these developments, political developments, offer people new possibilities for identifying. Ian Hacking, the philosopher Ian Hacking, talks about making up people. We are creating new sorts of people we can be. Yeah? And you saw that, the gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, they were not a type of person before. But they're in the media, people are speaking, we're not quite sure, are they progressive, are they conservative, reactionary, violent, peaceful, what are they? But they are new sorts of people. They're making up this new possibility. So Hacking says, numerous kinds of human beings and human acts come into being hand in hand with our invention of the categories labeling them. So I think that's a really fruitful way of thinking. Let's imagine and think, there were no gay people in the Renaissance period. There were people who had same-sex activity, but they were not gay in the sense that modern folk are. Being a woman has changed in the last 30, 40 years from what it was. Obviously, biology doesn't change, or not much, but our ways of thinking about these categories change. Your profession has changed in the years, certainly of those older people here. It has become a different sort of group of people. So disability politics, like other forms of organization, opens up new narrative possibilities for identity, which may have been unavailable before. It changes the possibilities for personhood, to use the phrase of Ian Hacking. So when we're thinking about this, and I don't think this is unfamiliar to you, we use the metaphor of storytelling quite a lot. This is familiar from psychology, but also from sociology. Identity is an aspect of the stories we tell to ourselves and tell to others. So we can't read off identity from context. We can't read it off from biology embodiment. It's a story. And a story always has a teller or tellers, and it has listeners. This morning we went to some stories. And I don't mean wrong, I don't mean fictions, I don't mean lies, but stories of people sharing their stories with you and also influenced by you. In his book about modernity, says self-identity is not a distinctive trait or even a collection of traits possessed by an individual. It's the self as reflexively understood by the person in terms of his or her biography. So you as psychologists talking and working with people one-to-one are reviewing people's biography. You're finding key events. You're helping them understand themselves or re-understand themselves in the light of what has happened or has not happened. Individual identity connects the social and the personal. It involves the individual putting themselves in a collective context. I am this sort of person. And in the world of sociology and symbolic interactionism, there's this great paper which is called Becoming a Marijuana User. And it's from the 1960s. And it's all about this. It's about, well, it's not about smoking dope. It's about understanding the rituals of, in those days, being a pot smoker, rolling a joint, passing the joint, what to say, what not, what it's like being stoned. It's not straightforwardly a psychochemical process. It's a social process, and it changes. So Giddens says, a person's identity is not to be found in behavior, nor, important though this is, in the reaction of others, but in the capacity to keep a particular narrative going. Really interesting stuff, some years old now. And because sociology, and Giddens was the sort of most famous sociologist of his day, is a form of storytelling. Ken Plummer is a sociologist who uses the concept of story to explore the ways that people understand and represent their sexual experience. He wrote a famous book called Telling Sexual Stories. So lesbians and gays coming out. There is a coming out narrative. People who've experienced abuse. There is a survivor narrative. Trans people now have narratives of that journey that they went on. And disabled people have those narratives. Disability is not having a spinal cord injury. It's not being born with blindness or whatever. It's the way you come to understand yourself in a culture, in a context, in a family, in interactions. So previously, there weren't so many narrative themes or devices that people could draw on. People were limited. They were fitting into somebody else's script, which was often very, very negative. But now, with the disability rights movement, new stories are being told, and we are creating ourselves for ourselves. We are presenting ourselves in different ways, rather than relying on traditional narratives of biomedical intervention, rehabilitation, cure, or misery, decline, and death. We are finding new ways of being. And this is the case for disability broadly, and for mental illness, mental health in particular. We talk about survivors, survivors of the mental health system. We talk about recovery. We talk about those journeys of hope and connectedness and so forth. Those are stories that we now have available to us. I come originally from Norfolk and Suffolk. We have the Recovery College there, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. A lot of these stories are about journeys. The journey story is very powerful. You can think about that in your fairy tales, in your novels, in your films. It's endurance, struggle, consummation, and often finding a home. That's the sort of where you come back to at the end of your journey. And so when we do it for ourselves, perhaps we can reconcile tensions and produce alternative, happier endings. We can tell different stories. So let me give you an empirical example from clinical psychology. As you heard, I supervised a couple of clinical psychology doctorates with psychologist friends at Norfolk and Suffolk Foundation Trust and medical school at UEA. And at the Recovery College, a colleague of ours called Kate Nurser looked at one of the courses, the modules in the Recovery College, which was telling your story. And Recovery Colleges near you will do this. She studied it at Recovery College East, but there's a similar course at Norfolk and Suffolk Recovery College. And so, as we know, the recovery approach, moving away from professional-led care, empowering individuals to become experts in their own self-care, this experts by experience that we're hearing about, building on their strengths to rediscover an identity separate from illness or disability. So we have connectedness, hope, identity, meaning, and purpose, and empowerment. That's about stories, really. Having a new story is central to identity, central to meaning. It's central to connectedness to others. And of course, in mental illness, a life story, an identity, can become disarrayed. It can become fractured. It can become full of pain and confusion. So on this course, they have 3 half-day sessions of forming the story, so bringing the disparate parts of your past into coherence, and 1 session of sharing the story with other students. And so Kate did a qualitative study with 8 participants using IPA and found themes such as storytelling being highly emotionally charged in both challenging and helpful ways. So Brad, 46 white British guy, said, well, I had a certain level of weight lifted from my shoulders. I got the full story I wanted to tell off my chest. So it actually helped lighten my mood a great deal. So really therapeutic, telling your story. Telling their story externalized difficult experiences and made them more manageable. And their second theme was about being safe to disclose. The audience, therefore, were a big part of the therapeutic benefit, the sense of nurturing that comes through sharing and listening. And you've been telling your stories. You've been telling your stories about the NHS or about private practice or about how you got here. You've been telling your stories non-stop, I guarantee it, since you arrived. That is what we do all the time as human beings. And so when Janie says, well, she's another lady, middle-aged, white British lady, you don't really go into deep, meaningful conversations with somebody as you would do on the course. So, you kind of really felt you had a connection with with people on the course. And where people are isolated and they have nobody to tell their story, nobody to listen to them, nobody sharing their identity, that is, then that's very difficult. But on these courses, people feel we're here to listen, people are willing to listen, and I'm validated by their listening. So it's both being a teller and a listener. Feedback shapes how you think about yourselves. People say, oh, no, I experienced that. Oh, that you shouldn't have to put up with that. It's part of a community of meaning. So 20 years ago, we did a book called The Sexual Politics of Disability. So I was very interested in identity then. And I felt that disability identity is about having stories, having the space to tell them, and having an audience that will listen. And that's what this study that Kate did was absolutely about. It's a novel opportunity, the Telling a Story course. It can provoke anxiety. It's not for everybody. It's not easy. But it also offers a chance to be genuine and to own your story. People feel a renewed sense of self, as if the process was a catalytic process. So Sarah, who's another 35-year-old white British lady, said, I just feel like it's like organized my brain a bit more, telling her story. Just that, no treatment as such, just telling her story on her own. Storytelling strengthens coherence and reformation of self through a sense of journey, triumph over adversity, and this survivor narrative, which is common to so many stories. And so we use the metaphor of coming out. We talk about coming out as disabled people, both people with hidden impairments, but also people who've always had an impairment but have never really engaged with that impairment. It's not just sexuality, it's also disability, mental health, many other experiences. I would call them predicaments. Predicaments being not a negative word like tragedy, not a neutral word like just difference, but predicament is a life thing, life event that you have to engage with, you have to deal with. Unemployment, redundancy, predicament. The crisis in the NHS, predicament. It's the thing you have to engage with.
So agency, because you're expressing yourself, you're formulating the story, is empowering. The individual has to take the lead. So when we did this book 20 years ago, The Sexual Politics of Disability, in the interviews we had with people with disabilities, I sometimes found exactly this process of self-definition and, importantly, self-redefinition going on. So I went and talked to people, lay people, and said, tell me about your identity as disabled or as your sexual identity. And that was really stupid. Because actually, most people don't use that word identity. It's not a common word. You know, you don't say to your neighbour at your bus stop, OK, tell me about your identity. I mean, you talk about it, I talk about it, but lay people don't. Excuse me. So people don't use that word or talk in those terms. But I was trying to help them make, or not help them, I was trying to ask them to present themselves to me. And as they talked, I found them making sense of their past, their disability, their trajectory. Just to tell you one story. I met a guy who was in his 50s. He had had polio in his youth. He had used a stick. He was mobility impaired, not very seriously. And he'd been very active in the campaign for homosexual equality in the 1970s, glad to be gay and all that stuff. He had described to me how he poured all his feelings of difference into his gay identity. But he realized that what he'd never come to terms with, he'd never even engaged with, is his disability identity. He completely suppressed that aspect of him. And so this research interview, quite fortuitously, became therapeutic, became cathartic, because you could see him, oh yeah, oh wow, that's really interesting. I haven't ever thought of that. In the process of describing himself, he was finding another dimension to his self, a suppressed dimension. And he wasn't the only person who seemed to find this process of disclosure and reflection therapeutic, not because I was, and I'm not, in any way presenting myself as having any counselling skills, and it wasn't an interview presented as such, but the very process of talking about their past and explaining themselves to me was about putting it all in order and working out who they were, which people don't generally do. Leave it to the police and the border guards to check that our papers are in order. So, you know the work of Irving Goffman, another person who's as famous among psychologists as sociologists. And in Stigma, a fantastic book, still relevant 50 years on, people who are socially excluded by virtue of physical impairment, mental impairment, sexuality, lots of other differences, have a sense of spoiled identity. He talks about them being discredited because their difference is well known, or they are discreditable because their difference is hidden and they want to manage information to prevent it coming out. And so there is this stigma which might either be enacted, the way people treat them, or it might be felt in the sense that they internalize that shame or anxiety. So we talk about self-stigma. And we're still, earlier this morning, you were using these words stigma. We're still using those words. We might want to use the words discrimination or cultural attitudes or whatever, but we come back to this sense of stigma. In my work in international development, we're talking about how disability is stigmatized in many cultures. But what Goffman says is in the context of a group, people reclaim their own sense of self, challenge stigma and self-stigma, replacing it with acceptance and belonging. And it's not necessarily for everyone. Not everybody wants to join a group. But for those that are, it's cathartic and validating. Because as Ken Plummer talks out, stories require audiences. He says, stories need communities to be heard, but communities themselves are also built through storytelling. Stories gather people around them. They have to attract audiences, and these audiences may then start to build a common perception, a common language, a commonality. And we see this over and again in the different contexts that we work. I'm sure that the people you work with, when they come together, they tell stories. Sometimes stories about you or about the NHS, but stories that present and represent themselves to each other and to others. And this notion of audiences highlights the vital importance of community and movement to disability identity and the symbiotic relationship between individual and collective. Just now on Breakfast TV, Liz Carr, who I remember as a disability comedian who's in Silent Witness, who's a now very successful disabled actor, was talking about her work on whatever it was, some breakfast TV program. And she came from the disability arts movement. We knew her and worked with her and loved her, and now, wonderfully, she's broken into the mainstream. But she is giving us different ideas, different options, different possibilities for personhood. So I want to move on to focus a little bit more on identity politics, because that's the next step, if you like. We have movements, we have groups, but then we have a political movement. And I was introduced as a member of the disability rights movement, and I have been since I was a student. So what's happening here? And, you know, you could turn to your people, Turner and Tajfel, social psychology of groups and social classification, social identification, social comparison, the way in-groups and out-groups operate. So you have it and we have it in sociology. What's going on? You identify yourself as members of a community sharing common values and traits. You then reevaluate the group and its values and traits in a positive light. And you transform from self-depreciation to positive valuation, what in the feminist movement was called consciousness raising, which leads to anger about the way you've been treated, resentment at being put down, and hopefully political action. And now last year we were 100 years on from the suffragettes, the suffragists, and that was exactly what they were about, was we're fed up with this. We demand the right to vote. We are equal citizens. And when you look at those slogans and those direct action activities of the suffragists and the suffragettes 100 years ago, you can see very much Me Too and these other movements of today. So, you know, it comes around in waves. Self-redefinition, not definition for others. Remember, Foucault, one should not be a homosexual, but one who clings passionately to the idea of being gay. Don't let them tell you who you are. Be yourself. Be, you know, part of this movement. And I think that's very helpful. But I think it's also problematic, and we'll go on and find out more about that. Because it almost comes down sometimes to a sort of what you might call an ethnic analogy, as if being a woman or trans person or disabled person or a gay person was like being somebody from a different cultural group, a different ethnic group, i.e. unchanging, essential, your inner essence, whereas in fact, maybe it's more complex than that. The, quote, the necessity of exclusion is made into the virtue of constructing of an independent culture. The necessity of exclusion is made into the virtue of constructing an independent culture. So you could say it's when a label becomes a badge. That's the metaphor I've used. A label becomes a badge. And many of you in the audience are Christians, and you may wear around your neck a crucifix. And that's a negative thing. It's an instrument of torture, but it becomes a badge. You may be gay, and somewhere in your wardrobe you have a pink triangle. That was a Nazi negative thing, but it's been made a badge, a positive thing. And we see that over and over again as words, as symbols are recuperated, reclaimed. Mad pride. There's a movement for mad pride, and so forth. Some of my friends talk about crip politics, cripple politics. And these are shocking, they're confronting, and that's what they're meant to be. The necessity of exclusion is made into the virtue of an independent culture. So, if you wanted to be a philosopher, you'd talk about the politics of recognition. You'd talk about Hegel, and you'd talk about how we see each other. But it's basically new possibilities for individual affirmation and identity. There's nothing wrong with you. It's the way you're treated. So in the disability world, we don't so much talk about mental illness anymore. We talk about psychosocial disability. The social model of disability says you are disabled by society, not by your body or your mind. So psychosocial disability means you aren't wrong, you aren't different, you're not inferior, you're not sick. You are treated badly by others, and that is the problem. Yeah? So there's people reject the way they've been trained to think, this idea of disability as a negative thing, this what would be called internalized depression. Paulo Freire, the great educator says, self-depreciation is another characteristic of the oppressed, which derives from their internalization of the opinion that oppressors hold of them. So often do they hear that they're good for nothing, know nothing, and are incapable of learning anything, that they're sick, lazy, and unproductive, that in the end they become convinced of their own unfitness. And a lot of the work that you do or we do in the political or therapeutic fields is helping people reject that negative story that they're no good, whether they're women or gay or people with depression or schizophrenia or physically disabled or whatever. That's a wrong story. They don't have to be fixed in that story. They can be different. So in that identity politics, they form solidarity with others. They're not alone. They're visible. Even if it's hidden difference, they're women's marches. This time last year, there was these enormous women's marches on Washington, or survivors' marches, or Me Too. People on Facebook say, Me Too. I've also been sexually abused. Visibility, solidarity gives us strength, a feeling of power and validation. And in some contexts, a culture, deaf culture, a gay culture, disability culture, survivor culture, African culture, whatever. So you're finding a space where your differences are valorized. And classically, neurodiversity. You would have talked about people on the autistic spectrum or with Tourette's or with these other conditions, and now that's challenged. There's spectrum, there's neurodiversity, we are neurotypical, there's revaluation, there are autobiographies by people like Temple Grandin and Donna Williams, there are films, there is a wonderful online presence, and so suddenly somebody who felt they were different has a category to join up with. That category becomes a subculture, auties or whatever. And then the existence of that category influences their own self-identity and maybe even their behavior. There's a different way now of being neurodiverse to what there was. And many people, as I say, who felt different now feel included. So the gay scholar Jeffrey Weeks focuses on this sense of shared identity. Identity, he says, is about belonging, about what you have in common with some other people, and what differentiates you from others. At its most basic, it gives you a sense of personal location, the stable core to your individuality. And Weeks has also said that finding the concept of identity is like finding a map to explore a new country. Finding a map to explore a new country. So a map makes things coherent, doesn't it? It shows you the where you might want to go. It shows you where you live now. A map for exploring a new country. So that's all good, this identity politics, celebratory, positive, new options. What might be difficult about these identities? And remember back to my title, subjection opens up the possibility of subjectification. It turns necessity to virtue, but it's an identity which is potentially problematic. So, for example, the Department of Work and Pensions did a research project called Disabled for Life in 2003. And they found that 52% of people who the Disability Discrimination Act defined as disabled didn't think of themselves as disabled. So 50% of the people that would, by government, be defined as disabled didn't identify as disabled. And in particular, young people were likely to reject their identification as disabled. In a survey of 200 disabled people contacted by the British Council of Disabled People, only 3% had heard of the social model, that idea that we're disabled by society, not by their bodies. So it didn't speak to them. They didn't want to be disabled, and they didn't think of themselves as excluded in that way. So the Disability Rights Commission changed their terminology to people who have rights under the Disability Discrimination Act. Because they wanted to work with all these people who didn't want to think of themselves as disabled. And similarly, when I did work with people with restricted growth, they said, oh, we're different, we're not disabled. Yeah, because it's a stigmatized identity, they don't want it. And I think at the base, people want to be in the mainstream. You want to be Salima or Fatima or Tom or Sally or whatever it might be. You want to have your neighbors, you want to be treated as an equal. You don't necessarily want to sign up with a group. Not everybody, not all the time. So my friend Nick Watson, in his research in Scotland, only 3 of the 28 people he did qualitative interviews with incorporated disability within their identity. They kind of normalized their physical limitations. They said, oh, yeah, I can't do that, but, I'm just really normal. They knew about discrimination. They said it was really bad, the way that somebody parked in their space or whatever it means. But they didn't want to do the politics. So a lot of people say, I'm really normal. A lot of people say, I'm not a feminist, but, and then they go on and say very feminist things. Yeah? So that's really interesting. So they've got some of the value system, but they're not wanting the group identity. They're not telling that story. So that, as I say, people with restricted growth, young disabled people, people with learning disabilities, very much so. There's this T-shirt you've probably seen, label jars, not people. Many people with intellectual disability reject the idea they're different at all. Robert Edgerton famously called this the cloak of competence. So it's kind of rejection of stigmatization. We're just like you. We're like peas in a pod. I can't see. Is that? Well, I've been through. I've got another 15. Great, thank you. Phew. I've got to wear my specs. So yeah, we have label jars, not people. And I think it's interesting because we all have multiple labels, don't we? We have multiple identities. I see a woman, I see hockey players, I see marmalade makers, I see allotment people, I see motorbike riders, I see cyclists, I see people who, Tottenham Hotspur supporters. I heard a Norwich City supporter this morning. But those identities, your mothers and daughters and sisters and fathers and sons, those identities might be actually very much more important to you, yeah, than disability. Then, you're all here as clinical psychologists, but you've all got we all got multiple identities. How salient is this identity? How salient should it be? Loads of people here have got spectacles, but I'm pretty sure you don't identify as disabled as a result, because it's just not salient. It's normal. It's just something you do. And we see this with older people. They might have quite profound disability, but they don't see themselves as disabled. They see themselves as old. This is just normal aging. Yeah? So, I talk to lovely psychologists, and particularly in Norfolk, and they say, we don't want young people who experience distress to identify as people with mental illness. We want to keep them in the mainstream. We don't want them getting into the patient mentality, self-defining as mentally ill people. So there are these multiple differences. There is intersectionality, that you're both disabled and black and gay or whatever it might be. These identities, these differences have different salience. And of course, from a movement point of view, there's a tendency to write this off. Internalized depression, false consciousness. You don't really know, why don't you come under our banner? But I think these are inherent in the issue of identity and difference. We can't just explain them away. So let's think about it a little bit more. Why might identity politics sometimes be a problem? One of the issues is the issue of locating the positive. Now, there's slogans, glad to be gay, sisterhood is powerful, black is beautiful. So there are identities which have done this, which have twisted it, changed it, and said, no, it's great to have afro hair, or it's great to be gay, or whatever it might be. It's not easy for everybody. It's harder if you have a disability, if you suffer distress. People have done it. The Hearing Voices Network takes auditory hallucinations and these delusions, said, no, actually it's positive. So people try to do it, and they succeed in doing it, but it's not always possible. Not possible for somebody to, how do you celebrate pain? How do you go, oh, it's great that I wake up in the middle of the night 3 times with my neuropathic pain. That's quite difficult to celebrate. Fatigue, oh, I love it, fatigue. No, it's not always possible to turn these negative experiences. A disability is so heterogeneous. It's not an ethnicity. It's not that we all hang, Steve and I, little guy at the front, can I call you little guy, Steve? Good looking, all right, so good looking little guy at the front. We are great pals, haven't seen Steve for ages. But, Steve lives in Timperley, I live somewhere else. We meet from time to time. We do get on very well, but, we don't have a secret handshake, is what I'm saying. We are different people, and we're not in the same club. There isn't a secret, well, there is, but we're not telling them that, right? So it's not homogenous. You get my point. It's not homogenous. And we don't need to talk about it all the time. And some people say, well, it's not, I'm not disabled, am I? It's just a difference. Well, they bracket it, so it doesn't matter to me. Like my man with polio and who's gay. It just wasn't important to him, hadn't been important to him. Some people want the badge but don't have the health condition. They want to feel different. They want to be part of the club. They want to feel themselves on a spectrum or whatever it might be. It's really important because they're a bit lost. And identities are actually very powerful places to be. They're strong places to be. You're with others. And we're so disparate and individual in this world that it's great to belong. You see people in church who they just want to belong. They just want to do something on a Sunday. They don't necessarily believe that stuff, but they want to be part of a gang, and they're comfortable there. And we see this with medically unexplained symptoms. We see this with fibromyalgia, with ME, and all these things. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because we spend a lot of time saying, oh, we're not interested in labels and we don't want to diagnose. There are some people out there who are desperately fighting for diagnosis. Really important to them to validate their sense of difference. There are new groups of patient activists, what Bill Hughes calls biological citizens, who are saying we want more diagnosis, we want more medicalization. Don't tell us that it's all in our mind. We want to show you that it's real and it hurts and you fail to understand it. So we've got all those salience issues and diversity issues. We've got the issue of escalating identities, the splintering off, what Freud called the narcissism of small differences. So, let's have a black disabled group. Let's have an autistic group of women who are Catholic, or whatever it might be. I'm not satirizing it. There are all these drives to be more and more specific. You can't know what I experience because you've got another disability, or whatever it might be. Leonard Davis says, the list of identities will only grow larger, tied to an ever-expanding idea of inclusiveness. After all, when all identities are finally included, there will be no identity. So there's a paradox there, isn't there? My title came from the poet Denise Riley, this subjection and subjectification, the quotation. The risks of reclaiming words like queer and cripple. The risk is that you identify yourself, you have a strong sense of who you are, but you're always stuck in that. I don't want to be a professional cripple. I don't want to spend all my time talking about disability. You mentioned a point of view on the radio. What's really important to me is that I'm not the disabled person who always talks about disability. I do talk about it sometimes, but the last time I talked about internet passwords, and I talked about dogs, and I talked about, anything other than disability. Because it's really important that you don't go, oh, God, there's that disabled guy on the radio talking about disability again. I am interested in other things, and I have a right to talk about them, and so it should be. Because there's a risk of reinforcing our separateness. It becomes essentialist. Marie Kondo and decluttering. And she said, what do? You go through your wardrobe and you pick this thing up and you say, does this shirt give me joy? Yeah? Now, I'm not criticizing that, but I saw, I don't have time for that, but I'm not criticizing that. I like this shirt gives me joy, by the way, and this top. But there was somebody on Twitter who was saying, this is disablest. What about people who don't feel joy? And it's oppressive to people who are unhappy. And I thought, oh, for goodness sake. And Twitter is the place where you get this. It's pushed to the extremes. There's always somebody who wants to out-separate you, who will go, oh, no, you're not separate enough. You should be this separate. So Twitter is all about identity. Twitter is the place. I hope somebody's doing a PhD about presentation of self on the internet. Goffman would have been there lurking all the time, taking notes. So Helen Liggett, even among the politically active, the price of being heard is understanding that it is the disabled who are speaking. So it freezes you in the minority group. It reinforces the dichotomy that you are trying to reject. By claiming an identity that's been created through the process of hierarchical differentiation and exclusion, says Galvin, subjugated peoples reinforce their own oppression and restrict their hopes to the belief that they can just demonstrate how positive it is to be identified as such. So they say, okay, we are different, but we're going to make it more positive. Yeah? And it's a victim position. Victimology is very powerful. And you might be rejecting the idea that you're victims of your medical problem by saying you're victims of social barriers, but you're still a victim. But victimhood is reassuring because it explains why you've not succeeded. It's reassuring because it says, oh, well, whatever we do, we'll still be ground down. It's your fault, it's not me. So I think that's problematic. So what's the alternative? I've said that identity politics has all sorts of problems, and I really firmly believe it does. What are the alternatives? Well, here we turn to Nancy Fraser. She says that rather than conforming to group culture and discouraging debate, rather than having this drastically oversimplified group identity, we should seek recognition not as member of a disadvantaged group, but in terms of individual status. She's talking about status subordination. And what she's saying is, look, we shouldn't be trying to valorize a group. We should be trying to make sure that two individuals are peers, that they can talk as equals. So women and men, straight and gay, disabled and non-disabled, what we want is for you, regardless of those differences, to be able to speak with anybody else as an equal. Not to valorize the group and say, our group are better than your group and give us space to speak and only we can define ourselves. But to say, as what we want, our goal is not to strengthen those groups, but to make sure that individuals can be recognized. They can parity of participation. Parity, peers, being a peer to others is really, really important. We are full members of society. We are on an equal footing. So that's what we want to aim for. That's our goal. Not our group, but us, different individuals should be able to speak as equals. So, I need to conclude. I could have gone on about the ICD-11, about diagnostic categories, done work on that, very interested in that. I know that we could have a different debate and argument about that. But let's not think about that. Because let's think about the reluctance people have to identify as different. And I think there's an ambivalence. Look at the research, for example, with parents. There's Ginny Russell and Bram Norwich did research with parents of undiagnosed children who had symptoms of autistic spectrum disorder. There's this ambivalence. They wanted to maintain their child's normal status. Parents wanted to maintain their child as normal in face of the threat of diagnosis. They didn't want confirmation of their fears. Diagnosis is scary and frightening and a millstone round the neck. They had a very negative view of having autistic spectrum. But equally, being diagnosed can be very important and valuable. If you're without a diagnosis, it's very confusing and unsettling, this uncertainty. Parents of babies with undiagnosed intellectual impairments feel much more stressed than parents of newborns with Down syndrome. So Down syndrome, we know what it is. Yes, all right, not what we wanted, but we can cope with that. Parents of children with intellectual disability, NOS, well, what is it? What does it lead to? How bad will it be? When I was paralyzed, the worst thing about being paralyzed was not being paralyzed. It was not knowing how paralyzed I would be and whether I would ever walk again. That's why I saw a psychologist, to try and deal with those feelings of uncertainty. Diagnostic and prognostic uncertainty is very difficult to deal with. So I wanted to make a case for sometimes very important to grasp onto that, to feel that certainty. But I've said that we should dissolve identity politics. I've said that we should have parity. But there's a problem here, because it's the identity politics that's formed the movement. Who do we connect with if we're all individuals? Who fights for us all? Where are the social ties that bind? And I think that we can only dissolve the groups, we can only begin to dissolve identities and speak as individuals if we work so much harder to build solidarity across stigmatized identities and within communities. This seems so important, that when we are working and our activities and our social connections, inclusion, whether it's sports or church or mosque or your work or activities or gyms or whatever, cultural groups, building those connections, regardless of your diagnosis, regardless of your health condition, is so important. Challenging the individualism which we have in this world. Promoting forms of solidarity, not disabled people against non-disabled people, not black against white, not trans versus feminists, but all of us coming together, not based on identity, but based on wider, less sectarian affiliations. Wherever we are, in the north of Ireland, in Britain, in our inner cities, we need to form ways of connecting. And it seems to me that what's important is what happens between minds, not just what happens within minds. And I would hope that your profession can help us with that. Thank you.